I'd like to tell you a couple stories that come from the trip I took while working for Heifer International, a trip I took flying with 91 pregnant Holstein heifers to Amman, Jordan from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. On that trip, I had a variety of experiences which were life-changing, and I'm going to share two of those interesting ones with you. In the morning, I was taken to visit an amphitheater that had been carved out of a mountain in rock and seated 5,000 people. It was very tall. It went up very steep. I could walk going up. Going down, I sat in my butt because it was so steep. 5,000 people carved into the rock. You could sit any place in that huge amphitheater and whisper, and down at the bottom, in the middle of the performance floor, down at the bottom, they could hear you whisper from any place sitting in that amphitheater. Now, how did people thousands of years ago know how to do that? I don't know. Halfway up the amphitheater, on both sides and in the middle, were doors that extended into tunnels that went way back into the mountain to small villages, and people would go from their villages through those tunnels rather than over the mountains to get to the amphitheater for whatever was going on for their entertainment. I just kept wondering, how did people know how to carve something like this? I'm going to come back to this amphitheater. Before we went to the amphitheater, we visited the largest, what was then, maybe still is, the largest Christian church on the continent of Africa. It was in Cairo, Egypt. It was named after St. Matthew. It had 12 huge stone pillars holding it up. The first floor, part of the first floor, was a museum with items from early Christianity that had been found. Down underneath, from where you walked underneath this church to where the church first floor was maybe 3 stories with these tall pillars holding it up. And there was a stone walkways that we were walking on and water on either side of the walkways. And we walked way back underneath this church. And there was a stairway going steeply up. And you could barely see it, but at the top of that stairway was a gigantic wooden door. I was told that behind that door were kept early Christians who were going to be martyred before they were led to that amphitheater to be eaten by the lions. Now let's go to even earlier in the day. Clarence, the vet who was with me, and I were walking around these mazes of buildings in the city, and we came to this building that first and second floors were burned down, but there was a sign over a stairway leading downstairs with St. George and the Dragon on it. And people were going in, and Clarence and I went in. We immediately saw that people took off their shoes, so we took our shoes off, and these nuns came dressed in traditional habits, and they put big iron horseshoes with long, thick chains hanging from one side of the horseshoe around our neck and hanging down over the front of our bodies, and pointed to a room. Again, we couldn't speak Arabic. They don't know English. We walked into this room, and there were all kinds of paintings and sculptures and ceramics and little tidbits. People, it was a prayer room, and people were very into their praying, very excited, very sad, all kinds of emotions being expressed as people prayed. And Clarence and I respectfully stood to the side and took this in. And after a while came back out, and the nuns lifted these horseshoes with the heavy chains off of our neck, laid them down, and came back and asked us, do you have any idea what was just hanging around your neck. I mean, we could tell it was a horseshoe with a chain on it, but no, we didn't know what it was used for. We were told that 2,000 years ago, those horseshoes with the chains had been wound around people's necks and arms. People who were going to be crucified, well, not crucified, but eaten by lions. Those same horseshoes and chains had been wrapped around Christian pilgrims who chose, because of their faith, because of their culture, because of their lives, their belief systems, their value systems, their ethical systems, they chose not to say they didn't believe in Jesus. They were wrapped up in these horseshoes and chains, led from St. George, the St. George place, prayer room, or wherever, to this church where they walked up this steep stairway into that room where they were kept until they were led down and out to the amphitheater where they were put on the lower level on one side in one room. The lions were kept on the whole other side in another room, and one by one, sometimes in small groups, the Christian martyrs were led out and the lions were let out, and people cheered and jeered and had fun watching the Christian martyrs get killed and eaten by the lions. That was pretty powerful for me. I actually went back to the St. George's prayer room 3 days later in order to experience the feelings I had having chains and that horseshoe put around my neck that had been around early Christians who chose freely not to give up their belief in Jesus. And I wondered then, this has now been over 30 years. I wondered then, I wonder now, if there ever would be anything I valued as much that I would be willing to sacrifice my life for what I believed, whether it was religious, whether it was something else. Is there something I believe in so strongly I would sacrifice my life? What kind of strong role do ethics and values and morals have to play in your life to say, I'm willing to be killed by a lion and then have my body eaten? Well, I just recalled that I told you the other story about that trip I was going to tell you today, but I have one more thing to share with you. This is real. If I ask you, if I was giving this away, if you would want it, what would your answer be? If, this is the same $100 bill. If I ask you, if I was giving this away, would you want it? What would your answer be? Let's pretend I had mud in my hand. It's all muddy, and I held it up to you all wrinkled and muddy, and I said, if I ask you, if I was going to give this away, would you want it? What would your answer be? So here's the deal. This is still a $100 bill. And it's the same with you. You are worth so much to so many different people. Sometimes you get folded up. Sometimes you get spit on. Sometimes you get tramped on. Sometimes you get crumpled up. Sometimes you just feel terrible. People have hurt you. You feel like you're not worth it. No matter what happens to you or how you feel, you are still the value of the same $100 bill, the same value that you've always been, so much to so many other people. Don't ever forget, your value does not go down just because the day goes really wrong or the week goes really wrong or you have a friend break up with you or your parents get divorced or whatever. You still have your full value. And I want you to remember that as you live out your life. I'll see you on Friday.